In this next video, we're going to look at global coverage statistics using data from the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement surveys. The JMP coverage indicators that we looked at in the last video were a major improvement over the data previously available globally and provide us a much more accurate picture of global water and sanitation coverage. But they don't enable us to look carefully at how coverage among different infrastructure services changes as a function of income. And for this, we're going to turn to the LSMS surveys. The World Bank's Living Standard Measurement surveys are unique from several perspectives. First, they use multiple infrastructure services for the same household. In other words, they collect data on electricity, water, sewers, and telephone services for the same household in the survey. Also, they probably provide us with the best information on household income and expenditures. Most of the survey instruments are devoted to collecting income and expenditure data. So this is very high quality data, enables us to look at coverage as a function of income or expenditures. Like the JMP, the LSMS use similar survey protocols across different countries. And they've been implemented in many countries. And finally, they've been accompanied by community surveys. So we have the option with the LSMS surveys of combining household data with community data, which enables us to get some new and powerful insights into infrastructure coverage. I'm going to be showing you some data and some analyses that I did with Kristen Komives and Wu Shun. Wu Shun is now the director of the Institute of Water Policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the National University of Singapore. And we're going to be looking at 4 questions. The first question is, who has infrastructure services? Who's covered? The second is, who has access to infrastructure services and chooses not to use them? Third, what do households prefer most? Which infrastructure services are most valuable to them? And which do they choose if they have options to choose among different infrastructure services? And then finally, what do households do when they're not served by formal infrastructure services? It's important to emphasize that the LSMS data used in these analyses are not a random sample of households around the world. They're only available for some countries.